might go on ahead. Since you're here, Vladislav, and two of the earliest questions are yours. Let's go ahead and look at them. All right. Do all of you have access to the questions? You can, if I read them, you can read along and you can check in with. If you do, yeah, okay. I take it that you do. Good. So you ask, during one of previous Q&A sessions, you mentioned that one of realizations after deep awakening is that everything is love. Could you please elaborate more on that? Why is that the case? You go on to say, it seems like sentient beings on this planet tend to experience a lot more suffering than pleasure in life. And now we all potentially face an anthropological existential threat, which could bring even greater suffering. How can we integrate these facts with the notion that everything is love? How would you explain it conceptually to a person who is not yet awakened? Well, thanks, Vladislav. That's a really good question, and let me give it my best shot here, okay? And feel free, any of you, to interject at any point in my response if you want further clarification, and afterwards to ask questions or raise related issues. So, I said, everything is love. Now, what I'm doing there is in the phrasing of that statement, I'm already putting it in the language that is most relevant to somebody that is unawakened. The other way I might have phrased that is that when we come to understand more deeply the way things really are, one of the things we realize is the phenomena which we humans experience and describe as love in its many, many manifestations is actually a very fundamental and universal property of all that is. Well, let me qualify that. It's a fundamental and universal property of all that we are at least capable of understanding that is. So I'm sort of turning it the other way around when I say everything is love. What I really mean is that the love that we think of and speak of as humans is a particular manifestation of a universal property. And this is very closely related to what I have to say about consciousness as information exchange. So information exchange is a kind of interaction, okay? And it is universal. If we look at the nature of these interactions, they can be creative, supportive, growth-inducing, protective, etc. But these interactions can also be, in their own ways, destructive. And I'm speaking of interactions between entities in general. Now, a viewpoint that I don't know how easily you can share, but what I have learned from my own experience and my observation And this extends to human history and essentially the history of the universe, is that those things that we would tend to, as humans, describe as negative, unfortunate, bad, destructive, so on and so forth, using all these negative terms, inevitably result in some sort of very positive outcome. This seems very counterintuitive to our own experience, but that's only because we usually evaluate our experience from a very human perspective and from a very self-centered perspective. It's more difficult to see that when something bad happens to you, that good things can ultimately come from it. But if we look, I don't know, let me just take a very large scale perspective on this. Do you know that all of the elements out of which life and worlds, planets, planetary systems, this aspect of physical reality, these are all created in the death, the destruction, the explosion of stars. Were you aware of that as a physical fact? Yeah, sure, of course.
Yes.
We can look at history and we can trace in the cultural development of many different cultures in the history how disasters of various kinds, both natural disasters and human-created disasters such as war, even such catastrophes as the Holocaust of World War II, from them, in the long run, has come very dramatic good, very dramatic changes that the effects of which are widespread and continue over a much longer period of time, okay? So this particular comparison, I think it's a good one because we don't have the same kinds of feelings towards exploding stars as we do about people dying in death camps. But we can see that the difference is our attachment to the notion of human beings like ourselves. If we can stand outside of that just enough to see the historical and cultural consequences of that, then you can perhaps see the similarities. We can bring it down to the events that happen to individuals. Now, sometimes the unfortunate events that happen in our lives, regardless of how much pain and suffering they may cause us as individuals, can be the impetus for tremendous growth and development of psychological strength and overcoming obstacles. Not always. In some cases, these are disastrous to the individuals. Sometimes they are on a large scale. For example, let's take an addiction like opioid addiction or alcohol addiction, for example. These have destroyed the lives of many people. But of course, only a small percentage of the people who have used both of these substances in very beneficial ways. So let's put it into the larger context first. Now, for any individual for whom alcohol or opioid addiction has become a major problem, there are some who have been in the more fortunate category, it has led them to the kind of personal growth, the dealing with psychological problems, so on and so forth, that has ultimately been beneficial to them, their families, their friends, and so forth. But in far, far more cases, it's led to ruined lives, early deaths, um, more pain and suffering than the alcohol or the opioids take away. On the other hand, if we look at the cultural level, human culture is growing in the direction of trying to understand this. After more than a century of attempts to uh, the so-called war on drugs and prohibition, they're starting to come to the same conclusions that were discovered when alcohol was prohibited. That only creates more harm. It puts these things into the hands of criminals. Um, we haven't quite achieved that level of level of understanding that in either of these cases, but we're much further ahead with alcohol than with opiates. But we're on the way to understanding that, or first of all, asking the question, why, out of all the people that use these, do most people derive some kind of benefit and minimal harm? You know, a glass of wine or a drink after dinner or something like that. Use of opiates to relieve pain with no tendency to continue them unnecessarily afterwards. Why is it that just a small portion of the population succumbs to these in a negative way? And what's emerging very clearly is that this has a lot to do with previous life trauma, childhood trauma, things like that. And we're on the verge of being able to deal with these in much more healthy and wholesome ways. The direction for this has been pointed by those few fortunate individuals who have managed to overcome these problems themselves. But once again, if we were able to leap ahead in time, I don't know how far we'd have to go, 50 years, maybe more, maybe even less. What we'll see is that compared to 100 years ago, that something very good that will extend, you know, assuming that humanity survives and that our culture, there is some sort of continuity of our culture, the potential is for something of tremendous value with ramifications for many other problems in the world. I mean, there are a lot of people who have problems in their lives that don't involve alcohol and opiates, but nevertheless are very destructive. What we're learning from this unfortunate aspect of our social history will eventually have tremendous ramifications. And it will spare in the future many, many people from a lot of pain and suffering that is potentially avoidable. So, okay, so I'm getting carried away here on this one direction. The whole point I want to make here is that interactions, whether they appear to us as positive or negative, all interactions seem to ultimately result in what we could deem as some kind of positive outcome. Another way I would put it is there tends to be the totality of the universe as we know it, or we might say suchness, appears to be evolving in time in a very positive direction. From a Buddhist perspective, we can see this potentially as being a point where all sentient beings are awakened and all sentient beings are freed from suffering. So back to love is everything, or everything is love, or love is a particular instance that we put a lot of emphasis on, of something that is a fundamental and universal characteristic of the psychological and physical universes as we know them. These interactions, if you look at something as simple as a hydrogen atom, a single proton and a single electron rotating around it. Well, electrons don't really rotate. They're really a field that exists. And the proton isn't really a particle in the middle, but it is a qualitatively different kind of it involves a couple of other kinds of forces in their respective fields. But let's just take the image of a proton and an electron. They are doing this dance of, let's call it, well, there's an exchange of information, so they actually fit the definition of consciousness. So even a hydrogen atom is a conscious entity from this point of view. But the interaction between the two is essentially creative. It's given rise to something new that is neither characteristics of protons by themselves or electrons by themselves. It is this phenomenon that we refer to as the hydrogen molecule and hydrogen gas with its properties. Now, one of its properties is it combines with oxygen in a particular way and produces something yet completely new, the creative process. So we see this kind of creativity arising out of interactions. And of course, the process, the long-term process of creativity also inevitably involves destruction. Evolution of organisms. If we didn't die, if we didn't age and die, evolution couldn't occur, right? It is built into us. It's built into us for a reason. So, yeah. So when I say everything is love, if we can recognize that, then we can take this phenomenon that we think of and understand as love, as unawakened beings, and recognize that to be fully synchronized with, in tune with, resonating with the unfolding of suchness, that this is something that we would like to manifest in all of our actions and interactions with others. Does that make sense to you? So, as a part of a whole that is manifesting this, as we become wiser, we realize that the best thing that we can do is to try to manifest as much as we can as an expression of and in resonance with that whole. So, by trying to share with you what I have learned about these things, I'm loving you. And that's the feeling that I have. That's why we practice loving kindness, right? And compassion and sympathetic joy. These are all manifestations of what we humans call love. When we say to somebody, be it a family member, a friend, a life partner, whatever, a romantic partner, I love you, we're manifesting loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy. Now, as we become awakened, we add to that insight, wisdom, and of course, the equanimity to accept that not everything turns out the way we think it should or the way that we would most like it to, okay? And there's downsides along the way. So is that helpful?
Yeah, I understand it from a practical perspective. It's very helpful. I was of thinking globally, especially about animals for a lot right now.
Mhm.
And also, like, for millions of years, beings had to suffer, and even humans before modern age, they didn't have medicine, they had lots of diseases, and there was lots of suffering. So I was also looking at that from that perspective, and it was, I generally agree with you, and I'm also an optimist. And I agree with that philosophy that everything is getting better. I was just having troubles integrating that amount of suffering which happened and is still happening with the amount of love which is growing. But I think I can approach it now.
I'm glad that's helpful to you. That's wonderful. And I want to deal with that second aspect, which I haven't really dealt directly with. The amount of suffering there is in the world and what the Buddhists taught us about that and what we can realize ourselves through our practice. But does anyone else want to comment on what I've already said before I extend it into this other domain?
You know, looking at evil, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Looking at evil is and seeing things in good and bad, and a struggle between good and bad is so pervasive in our media.
Yes.
And it even has spread to the media that there are wars that go on between planets and stars, or stars and stars, that they portray them as fighting. So there are a lot of things that are going on that are just going on, and our calling them good or evil has nothing to do, or even good or bad.
That's right.
My death, and if I die in my backyard, well, maybe I'll provide a good meal for a critter. You know,
Right.
in which case the critter is going to have a good time. So I think that it really depends on one's perspective. Even the whole idea of suffering oftentimes is a strong motivation, at least for me, and I think I've seen it in others, for practicing Dharma. And that's all. That's, I guess.
Well, that's a wonderful observation, and thank you for adding that to this. And it makes a very good segue into what I was going to talk about too, because you use the word suffering, and so did Vladislav, in a way that the Buddha deconstructed, and that I think it's very useful in terms of understanding these things to carry out that same deconstruction. Now, it is very much a matter of perspective, of how we perceive things, that we model in our minds the universe as consisting of good and evil. That's actually a very primitive notion. Even in terms of human behavior, it would, if you think about it, it's reactivity from their own suffering and ignorance that constitutes what we would consider evil in human behavior. So our perception it really is very unrefined. And that's really what awakening is about, is to make a fundamental shift in perception, to change entirely the perspective by which we view these things. Now, what did the Buddha tell us in the First Noble Truth? He made a distinction which, unfortunately, for many people who look at the Dharma, they don't quite catch it. And In English, in Pali, it's the difference between dukkha dukkha and domanassa dukkha. But in English, we can express the same thing, I think, effectively, if we call something pain or just simply unpleasantness, as opposed to suffering, which is also a kind of unpleasantness. So the dukkha aspect is the same in both pain and what I would call suffering. The difference is that pain is a sensation that gives rise to unpleasantness. That is the qualia that arises from it. Suffering is a mental phenomenon in response, that does arise in response to pain, right? But it is not the same as the pain. It's arising out of our resistance to the pain, of mental activity, things going on in our own minds that create a new kind of unpleasantness that is actually multiplicative to the pain that gave rise to it. This is expressed by Shinzen in suffering equals pain times resistance. So here he's making the same distinction I do between suffering and pain, and he's identifying basically craving. Resistance is, or craving is the resistance to what is, wanting things to be different than what they are. Wanting them to be different in kind of an unwholesome way that results only in increased unpleasantness that we call suffering. When you speak, Vladislav, about we look at this world and we see that there's so much suffering, you're not seeing things very clearly. There is a tremendous amount of pain that characterizes life. The amount of suffering, though, just as in Shinzen's equation, and just as in the Buddha's second arrow analogy, too, he's talking about the same thing there. There is the pain, that's the first arrow. Then there is the suffering the mind generates in response to it, that's the second arrow. And as Shinzen points out, they're multiplicative. So if you have 10 units of pain and you add to it, or you multiply it by 10 units of resistance, craving for things to be different, you end up with 100 units of suffering. So those units we could call unpleasantness. So 10 units of unpleasantness caused by a physical injury or an illness or a personal loss or something else like that gets multiplied to become 100 units of unpleasantness, and 90 of those are in the category of suffering. Humans stand out from every other living organism because we live almost entirely in the world of our own stories. And all of our stories are about how what should be different from what it is, ultimately, if you think about it, or attempts to try to believe that things are different than what they are, which is very, very widespread, to the degree that we go through our lives trying to pretend that things are different than they are. We're just going to get smacked in the face over and over and over again by the way things really are. And every time it's going to hurt. It's not going to hurt through our sense organs the way that a bruise or a cut or a burn or something like that would. It's going to happen on the mental level. Animals don't do this. They don't have the capacity to elaborate these, to create all of this elaboration, all of this papancha, as it's called. And so it's out of that papancha that all of our suffering comes. Humans suffer many magnitudes more than do animals. Just as talking about planets and stars and galaxies being at war with each other is what's called an anthropomorphization, right? So is looking at the lives of an animal from human terms. Certainly, if we were prey animals, we would elaborate that fact enormously, and we would suffer so much more than a mouse or a deer or other prey animals do. They don't carry out that elaboration. As the Buddha said, birth is painful. Now, I don't know that most animals experience as much pain in the process of birth as humans, simply because it's a much easier, physiologically and anatomically, it's an easier process. But life is characterized by injury, suffering, and aging. Now, actually, I doubt that animals experience much. Death itself can be painful, but it's the process leading up to death that is painful. Death takes care of itself. It's only the fear of death, the resistance of death, all of those kinds of things that make death the cause of so much suffering. Now, what the Buddha offered us in the first three noble truths is, first truth, pain is inevitable. Birth, illness, injury, aging, and the process of dying are painful. Suffering is optional. Second noble truth, suffering arises out of our resistance to what is, our craving for things to be different than what they are. Third noble truth, this is rooted in our self-clinging, and if we can drop the self-clinging and the craving that arises from it, we can be free of suffering. We'll be left with the inevitable pain. But for what we stop doing is turning 10 units of unpleasantness due to physical pain into 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 units of suffering, of unpleasantness in the form of suffering. We likewise don't take just things that happen the way they are and truly produce no pain in and of themselves and take them from zero into a huge magnitude of suffering. So really what this is all about is relieving this unnecessary suffering that we humans generate for ourselves that is unnecessary. It's optional. Through the practice of the Dharma, we can free ourselves of that. Now, in addition to that, another things that we humans do, is out of our suffering, we create so much suffering for other beings and other people in particular. In trying to make things better for ourselves, in some way or another to relieve our suffering, even if our suffering arises from not having something we want or not being able to do something we want, or whether it's trying to eliminate some pain or suffering that we're already experiencing, we tend to do that at the cost of creating much more pain and suffering for other beings. So does that deal with the second part of it? I mean, love is the opposite of that. Love is we stop doing that. We recognize that all sentient beings want to be happy. All sentient beings want to be free from suffering. To create unnecessary and avoidable pain and suffering is to be totally out of tune with the evolution of suchness. Let's let go of it. Let's learn to practice loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy in place of it.
It was very clear, thank you, and illuminating.
Wonderful. So let's see, I just check in to see if, no, Chris has not come yet. So you have a second question about Vladislav, and I'm taking them in order of when they were done. A related question.
Question in the chat.
What's, oh, there's something in the chat I missed. Okay, let me look. Suffering is directly correlated with lack of awareness. Well, I would flip that around and say increased awareness is directly related with decreased suffering. Okay, so in animals, it isn't the fact that they tend to dwell more in awareness than in that analytical storytelling, confabulating domain of the human left brain, linguistic, symbolic processing, and all of that. It's just the absence of that. It's not the presence of awareness. But for humans, if we increase our awareness and awareness becomes predominant over this part of our minds, this attention-rooted storytelling, elaboration, papancha, then that will lead inevitably to some decrease in suffering, even if it's not framed within some spiritual path that is intended to lead to that goal. So I would say with much more confidence that an increase in awareness in human beings will inevitably lead to some decrease in suffering. And so there is a direct correlation between the two. It may not be a one-to-one correlation. It may be variable upon many, it is variable upon many other factors. Okay. So it's direct, but it's not simple. Put it that way. It's a direct but complex correlation. Okay, looking at this next one. A related question, some religious branches of Buddhism use the fact of suffering to promote an idea of finishing endless cycle of reincarnation and getting out of samsara. To them, living is suffering and this whole material world is dukkha, and nirvana is a way to get out. I understand the problems with the notion of reincarnation and how it was incorporated from Hinduism. You discussed it quite often before, but is there any value at all in such teachings? I personally find it repulsing and quite nihilistic to view existence as bad and something to be escaped from. However, so many Buddhist schools and experienced meditation teachers promote this idea and are basing it on the suttas. So I'm feeling quite confused. What is your opinion on this approach to Buddhism? Well, the most generous thing that I can say about this is that it can serve as a motivation for some people to practice. It is such a gross oversimplification of and distortion of what the Buddha taught that, you see, my experience teaching Chinese community in Southern California, some Taiwanese and some from mainland China. There is a great resurgence of interest in Buddhism in mainland China since the attempts to annihilate Buddhism have ceased. Okay. In trying to teach them, I had large numbers of people who were drawn to Buddhism, well, first of all, because of their cultural background, but on an individual basis were led to practice and attend teachings more than the average Asian. I'm talking California, so let me call let me refer to them as Asian Americans, either immigrants, Asians, or first or second generation Asian Americans with this background. While it brought them to me into my teachings and my retreats, it also, as they progressed in their meditation practice, it created an enormous obstacle, because inherent in this idea is an extremely powerful reinforcement of the idea that there is some kind of Atman, self, something that is essentially me, that could continue from one lifetime to another. And I see them teetering on the edge of awakening, of insight into no self, have experienced all kinds of insight, but having this huge obstacle that allows them to integrate the other insights of impermanence and emptiness and interconnectedness into this full insight into no self and the nature of suffering that allows them to achieve awakening. So that's the problem with it. What it's a distortion of is that Buddha took this Hindu idea. And first of all, one of the things that there is no word, I don't believe there is a word in the Pali language at all that corresponds to reincarnation. There may be, but certainly in the language that the Buddha used, the Pali that's derived from Magadhi and the Magadhi family of languages, the term that the Buddha uses doesn't even really mean rebirth, it means birth. And what it's referring to is the birth of the self. He borrowed upon the previous idea, previously existing, more primitive, simpler, and less useful notion of the reincarnation of some permanent self into a new body and a new life. And he recontextualized it in terms of what really happens. The self is a fabrication of our minds. It's not even a persistent fabrication. It takes many forms. It is constantly being reborn over and over and over again. Every morning when we wake up, the self is reborn over and over again throughout the course of the day in different situations. The self is born again. It's born, it passes away. It's born, it passes away. It's born, it passes away in the course of a life. And every time the self is born, it's associated with a process that gives rise to craving and increases the amount of suffering that the individual experiences as a result of it. If we can take this notion, which is a beautiful way of saying, of reframing the idea of reincarnation and escape from the eternal wheel of samsara, of birth, death, and rebirth, and we apply it where it counts to each individual human being in their own life. It says, it's not giving this distant promise that, well, if you achieve awakening in this lifetime, then after your body dies, it won't be born again. And if your life is miserable, yeah, when I die, I don't want to be born again. How about bringing it down to earth where it really counts? When I wake up tomorrow, I'd like not to suffer the way I did today. And that's what it's really all about, okay? The next time this kind of thing that happens, which has caused me so much suffering right now, I would like not to suffer because of it. this process that I am, that has no core self to it, but which keeps regenerating this illusion of self, that's what can cease happening. I can cease generating this illusory self, which brings me so much suffering. That's what the Buddha was talking about. Now, it was very easy in that 500 or so years before the Pali Suttas were written down for the first time, and during which there were many, many different schools and interpretation of Buddhism. Prior to during the 600 years before they were written down in Sanskrit. And fortunately, some of these were written down in Chinese before they were written down in Pali or Sanskrit. We can get kind of a picture of what happened. Whereas the Buddha had taken the idea of reincarnation and applied it in this much more powerful, beautiful, and realistic way, it was very easy for those who were trying to integrate Buddhism into Indian and other societies as a religion and as something that was acceptable to a larger and larger number of people, to just simply undo what the Buddha had done in his teachings and to rephrase things, redact things, add a little few things here and there. Often it takes no more than the change of a single word to completely change the meaning of a whole sutta. And fortunately, we have, between the Chinese agamas and the Pali canon and a few remnant versions of Sanskrit canons, scholars can look at this and they can see how this process happened. So as I just sum it up, my most generous evaluation of this is, yes, it has helped bring some people to the Dharma, but it is also harmful and an obstacle. So those that it has brought to the Dharma must eventually overcome it, and it is more difficult for them than it is for somebody that has not had this kind of indoctrination and reincarnation. And going back to my experience with the Southern California Asian community, predominantly Chinese, but also included Vietnamese and a number of other Asian origins. What I found is that especially the second generation Asian Americans, and to some degree the first generation Asian Americans, were the ones who could let go of this idea most easily. Those were the ones just simply in the interface between the Western view of things and the traditional Asian view in the Buddhist context of reincarnation. It was weaker. It was not so deeply embedded. It had not been so fully assimilated. And so they could overcome this obstacle more easily. Yes, there are a lot of teachers who, drawing upon traditional sources, who don't know any better, who still cling to this. There are other teachers, interestingly enough, who know better, but still try to find, who still want to support the validity of this modified form of Buddhism as something, something that can be held up as the perfect teaching, right? And so they try to rationalize their way around this. And it's almost comical listening to and reading their attempts to do this. Because you can tell if they know better or not. And if they do know better, then the intellectual contortions that they go through in order to try to rationalize what they know experientially with the belief system that they want to represent and support. It's astounding. So that's all I have to say about that, which as usual is a lot. If there's no comments, then I go to your question, Barbara. All right. What amount of meditation is needed to maintain stage 10 and stay in the state of samatha? How stable is the state of mind? How long without concentration meditation would you drop out of it? Is it realistic for a layperson to stay in the state of samatha? Could you also elaborate the role of insight in achieving stage 10 and describe the state of samatha of stage 10 with greater detail? Okay. How the amount of meditation required to maintain it, its stability, and how long you could go without meditating in order to maintain it. The answer to this is, once again, we have to look at the complexity of all of the different factors. One of the most basic ones is, how well established is this samatha, and how long, and how, in other words, how much rewiring of the brain has taken place that facilitates the mind system entering into a stable state of samatha. And then this mind system is constantly, especially for a layperson, especially if you aren't in a cave or in a forest hermitage or something like that, this mind system is interacting in an extremely complex world. It will depend very much on how much insight a person brings to this process, how deep their understanding, how well developed is the state of samatha. In general, what we could say is, short of a very, very advanced person who's very advanced on the path, it will always take continued meditation to maintain a degree of that samatha and to make that state resilient in the face of real life events for lay people with jobs, relationships, living in the kind of world that we do. So realistically, the more meditation that you continue to do to reinforce that state, and the more frequently you do it, then the more resilient that state is going to be. But I have described in TMI the factors that erode it. And if you look at not the external factors, but the internal factors that determine the mind system's reaction or response to those events, that is going to be a major factor. That's why the degree of insight and path attainment is going to play a major role in the stability and resilience of the state of samatha. Right? That makes sense to you? Yeah. So the degree of mindfulness that you can sustain. Now, the other thing that I would mention too is it is so rare. It's as rare as hen's teeth almost, not quite, for someone to be able to achieve that stage 10 level of samatha sustained outside of active formal practice without already having achieved insight and some degree of path, extreme entry at the very least, and sometimes much more than that. So usually somebody who is at stage 10 already has the advantage of well-established insight, a very fundamental shift in perception that allows them to deal with the vagaries of life, particularly of a layperson in our modern world. Is that a satisfactory answer?
Yeah, it is. To just supplement a bit, my the reason why I'm asking is I'm having a lot of inside experiences, and I feel like it's deepening, and I'm becoming pretty happy with the state of mind, and I don't feel like I need to push into that extreme amount of concentration and to deepen into it. So the question becomes, is it useful, or should I go through all that work to that extreme state of mind, I guess?
Yes. Well, let me just say, your mind is a system, a complex, dynamic, open system, a self-organizing system. It is the most complex system that we know of in the physical universe. The human brain is the most complex system we know of, other than the universe itself as a whole, okay? Which includes brains of every kind, all right? So, you know, considering the complexity of your mind system, do not be surprised. Right now, some portion of your mind system is experiencing progressively deepening insight, and that is extremely conducive to this sustaining the state, and perhaps without needing to enter into deep states of, I hate the word concentration, let's say samatha, which includes mindfulness and vipassana, and as well as stability of attention. Okay, so so sooner or later, the other parts of your mind system are going to they're going to be drawn into this, and they're going to bring their ignorance into it. And it's going to destabilize what you're experiencing now. When that happens, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's like a group of people who have achieved deep understanding are joined by another group of people who don't have that understanding. And so now the collective, it seems to have taken a step backwards in its level of wisdom, but it hasn't. No, it's entered into a process of deepening and expansion of the wisdom of the first group, and this will go on. So, yes, this ultimately the end of this process would be when the entire mind system, including all of its simplest sub to whatever order you want to make it, minds. Some of those sub-minds that were established during your childhood, during different parts of your life, and emotionally and psychologically traumatic situations, in intellectually conflictive situations, and all of these other things. There are these residual parts of your mind system that are there and are a part of things, and they're in the background, and pretty soon, sooner or later, eventually, they're going to have to come into the foreground to become a part of this part of your mind system that is achieving insight and will achieve, if it hasn't already, some degree of awakening and progressively greater degrees of awakening. Elizabeth.
Yeah, just maybe to add, if you are in a state where there have been some insights and there's a sense of shamatha, perhaps off the cushion, a sense of equanimity, take this as an opportunity to explore, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes go more deeply into concentration, do the extra effort to see what it feels like. Sometimes let that relax a little bit, try it out in different circumstances, right? And so this is an opportunity to play and explore. There's a level of mastery that kind of comes with being able to play with something. So if you're in a good spot, take this as an opportunity to play a little bit, not just in the deep end of the pool, but not neglecting that, right? So stay in some of the areas, maybe do a little bit less meditation. What does that feel like? How does that work? Then try adding some meditation, or maybe even a different style of meditation. See what happens, and use that as an opportunity to explore. That may allow different parts of the mind system to come in and be integrated. It may just give you a better feel of this territory you're in now, looking around and exploring this part of the mountain of, oh, cool, look at this. So it doesn't have to be I always have to shove into, the deepest possible absorption, but but that still may be a useful thing to try. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
That's tremendous wisdom. Good advice. So anyone else have a comment at this point? So I don't see Juno, Pablo, or Chris here. So I'm going to go back, and the oldest question that we
Juno's
have.
still logged in.
What's that?
Juno is still logged in.
Oh, Juno.
I'm
Oh,
here.
yeah. Sorry. Yes, you are Juno. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I'm taking Juno's question next. It's next in order. Wonderful. Sorry, Juno. I apologize.
No problem.
Okay. As someone who's been a lifelong spiritual seeker, I have read and practiced in different faiths, but finally found what I was looking for in Buddhism. There's one aspect that I missed from before, and that is prayer. Ironically, I never used to like praying very much, but now that is not really included in secular Buddhism. I miss it. I know there are religious Buddhists who pray to Buddhas and Taras, etc. But could you talk about the place of prayer in early Buddhism and whether we can still incorporate prayer and chanting in our practices? Who are we praying to if there is no God and Buddha was human? Can we pray for help? Can we get help or connect to previous Buddhist masters? I've always felt a strong connection to Dipa Ma, even though I never met her. How would prayer be explained as working in Buddhist philosophy? I know there are a lot of questions here, or there. Essentially, I'm looking for an overview of prayer from a traditional Buddhist perspective. Okay. Let's take this. Let's take this overview approach to it. Let's ask ourselves the question: what is prayer? Now, at its most superficial level, at its really most superficial level, it consists of the repetition of words. Sorry. Oh, just a second. Hello, can I call you back later, please? I'm in a meeting. Sure. Oh, thank you. I'll do that later today. Thank you. Bye. Sorry, it's about prescriptions. Okay, reciting words is the most superficial level of prayer. Let's just leave that out of the picture. We're not interested in that. Let's say you're sincerely praying, whether or not you're repeating formulaic prayers or not. is really coming from your heart. What is that really? It's a powerfully held intention. It may take the form of imploring a God or some being, some power greater than yourself, to manifest something in some way. But the God, all of that other parts of it, and the idea that that you're asking something or someone else to make something happen, that's just the conceptual overlay by which we understand what we're doing. And we can understand that same process in a less primitive and more realistic way. And when we do, what we see is it is a profound act of intention. And intention is the most powerful thing that these self-organizing systems that we are can do, is to form and sustain intentions. And you know, there is even scientific research validating the fact that strongly held intention can alter physical processes. There is much more common experience of the fact that strongly held intentions can, in some way or another, cause the manifestation of those things that we intend. All of those people who have wished me well in one way or another in my health problems, I give them credit for the fact that I'm alive now and as healthy as I am in this moment. At least they deserve part of the credit for that. Intention, the power of intention is real. Prayer is a particular manifestation of that. The more, it has a lot in common with shamanic practices, which are shamanic healing practices. One of the things is that this kind of intention is the more effective to the degree that it's not rooted in self-clinging. Sound familiar? So in other words, prayers for someone else tend to be more effective than prayers for oneself, unless one thinks of oneself in a more objective and detached way. And then the power of intention, once again, plays a role. You know, my first exposure to the power of intention, and there's been much cruder manifestations that have arisen since, but was Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. And I read that many years ago. Basically, his formula is, if you focus your intention on wealth, then you will be highly attuned to anything and anyone you encounter, anything you hear, read, see, that is relevant to that. It will become the primary focus in your life, and you will speak to and ask questions of and receive advice from people that will help you achieve that, so on and so forth. But he makes the point that you have to focus on the condition that you would like to arise as a result, not on you becoming wealthy. And that is something that's lost in some of these more modern versions of it that have, I can't think of one of the most common ones, what it goes by. But prayer is a very real thing. It's a very powerful thing. It is the power of intention. It is present in Buddhism. The Buddha redefined karma as intention. because it's the intention behind our actions that create ourselves and that create the reality that we live in. And so that is inherent in Buddhism. Yes, it's the mind, your human mind has to frame intentions in a certain way for them to be most effective. With the AA 12-step program, one of the things that you're asked to do is to appeal to something greater than yourself. In its more modern manifestations, whatever form that higher power takes need not be some kind of personal God or any kind of personalized higher power. It can just be a higher power. It's inherently there in Buddhism in the sense that the wholeness, suchness, that the tathata, that the Tathagata has gone to, comes from, dwells within, is that higher power, is what the mind may need to visualize as God in whatever form. It may need to be some father figure or for some mother figure or something like that. Whatever the mind needs to do for the state of development it's at is appropriate to the person to invoke the power of intention. And that's all that prayer is. So prayer is and should be a part of Buddhism. And for secular Buddhism to ignore that is just another one of the problems with it, of the trying to reframe something from too pragmatic a perspective and falling into the trap of losing the larger picture that the Dharma is, that any spiritual path is. The essence of Taoism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Native American traditions, I mean, you know, any spiritual tradition, the essence of it ultimately is the wholeness and interconnectedness that we are a part of something much, much greater than ourselves. However, it works best for us to participate within that wholeness in the most wholesome way. And this goes back to the very first question we dealt with, Vladislav's question of love. You know, I believe that was Vladislav. Yeah, is yes. Prayer is a manifestation of love. It's a manifestation of participating in the wholeness of everything. And it doesn't matter what the belief system is that frames the way you invoke the power of intention. Would you care to comment, Juno?
Sorry, technology. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. As I said, when I really started doing TMI and investigating Buddhism more deeply, I felt that there was just this something missing, and it was because I was looking at a lot more of the pragmatic and secular approaches to things. And then recently I just decided to sort of start including well, I suppose the metta practices are a very good example of a form of prayer. And since I've started including that sort of thing, just sort of praying for the well-being of people that I love and care about in the world and that sort of thing, I find that my practice is more satisfying generally. So I appreciate you explaining. I mean, I think I understood the other day I was reading the 7th interlude, again. And there you add the final sort of piece to the puzzle of the mind system. And then I realized it really hit me quite strongly that what you're suggesting there in terms of systems theory is that the mind is part of a larger system. And that in systems theory, one thing we know is that one element in a system can influence other elements. Even very distant elements can be just sort of a ripple effect, right? And it was such a big revelation for me that I said, oh, now I know where he was going with all of this stuff. And I feel like prayer is a way of activating one's influence in that system. And specifically with the Deepa Ma, I wanted to ask you about that, sort of having access to the wisdom, compassion, and love of people who are no longer physically with us. I was reading Deepa Ma's biography, and somebody said, you know, there are people still today who, you know, have been born long after Deepa Ma's died, and yet they still feel they have access to her wisdom, love, and compassion. And perhaps you could just speak a little bit about that, because it's something that I found quite moving and quite surprising, really.
Well, yes. If you think about it, you will have heard me speak about something very similar many times in the context of my own experience. Let's put it this way. In every moment, the entirety of the past is present in that moment. It is what created that moment. And the potential of the future is present in every moment. So Deepa Ma, although Deepa Ma may no longer be walking the earth in a human body, her life, her wisdom, her understanding still exist, embedded as an integral component of each present moment. You know a little bit about my metaphysics of non-duality of mind and matter. The total interconnectedness of matter is reflected in the total interconnectedness of mind. How could it be otherwise if they are both just the same thing, same stuff seen in different ways? So I have had the experience, this is what so-called past life experiences really consist of, is entering a state that resonates with the knowledge, wisdom, experience, or otherwise of some other being that has lived, or many other beings who have lived before, or even who are contemporaneous. It doesn't really matter. So absolutely, Deepa Ma is present in every moment. If you are somebody in your localized mind system who is aware of her and her teachings, and you resonate that with that, to the degree that you resonate with that, Deepa Ma is still, her life, her wisdom, her insight is there, and it's accessible by you. And likewise, without intending to, I often, when I'm teaching, access the answers to questions. I know it's coming from other beings, whether, you know, and in the moment they could be long dead, or they could be just alive and living next door or on the other side of the world. I don't know. But I feel myself accessing the wisdom of others. And why not?
Yes, and in the very worst case scenario, if none of that is true, it does have a very positive, beneficial effect on the individual. They've done a lot of studies showing how people engaging in prayer tend to heal faster, and yes, people who know that they're being prayed for tend to heal faster, and that sort of thing. And I think it's beautiful. I think, as you said, you've pointed it out well. People get very tense and unhappy when one brings in sort of quote unquote religious practices. But that I think pragmatic Dharma is in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because they take too simple a view of these things. And that's often the problem, right? Especially with Buddhism, is there's the idea of karma or rebirth or whatever, and people look at the most simple versions of it and they actually misunderstand how profound and nuanced some of these ideas are. So thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense to me, and it's I think my last question / comment about this would be, does that also mean that people that we love, once they've passed over, we still kind of have access to their imprint on our lives?
Yes, we do. And that is actually how the final stage of grief manifests, is that rather than being in the pain of our own loss, when grief finally matures, it's we hold the presence of that person we love who has passed within us and sustain us.
Yeah, yeah, and that can be so soothing and comforting and powerful, and that's beautiful to know. You know, it does take some of the sting out of death, doesn't it? Thank you very much, Culadasa. I appreciate your answer.
You're most welcome. Thank you for your question. Chris has a question, first and oldest one here. He says, let's say you have the realization that you drifted away from the meditation object and are coming back celebrating this realization. However, if the thought that captured your attention was of a dark nature, will the celebration of coming back connect this achievement in your brain with the returning to the present or with the dark thought? Very simple answer, Chris. It is going to, what you are celebrating is having come back, having reawakened, having been lost in a dreamlike state, and it may have been a dreamlike state of a dark nature. It doesn't really matter the nature of it. What you are celebrating is the waking up, and no part of your brain or mind is going to associate that that feeling good about having woken up with the dream you had while you had slipped into a state of sleep again. So you don't need to worry about that at all. In simplest terms, we could just say your mind is most likely to associate a strong emotion with the most recent event that triggered it. And so if you invoke that emotion of joy, of happiness, of being pleased that you have now come back into the present, that is what it's going to be associated with. Not anything that preceded that. So you don't need to worry. Anyone else want to comment on that before I look at Pablo's question? Let's have a look at Pablo's question. He'd like my take on the difference between feelings and emotions, and how can we feel good, loving, positive on a daily basis, even if we're going through a phase of shadow work where all we can feel is painful and confusing feelings, thoughts, and emotions. I've been focused for a long time on healing all my past traumas. Now I feel like I forgot how to feel good again. Pablo, I wish you were present, and I wish we had more time and we could go into this a little more deeply. First of all, I very, very strongly recommend that you do a lot of the kind of meta meditation that I described in the appendices to the Mind Illuminated. That is the intentional cultivation of exactly these positive states of mind that you are having trouble recalling. And it is the practice of recalling those. I think it's wonderful that you're working to resolve past traumas. And one of the things that's characteristic of the successful resolution of a past trauma, along with a feeling often of being relieved of a burden, or just a feeling of relief in general, is also a feeling of joy and happiness, a kind of a very positive feeling. And if that is not arising, then how to say this when you're not here, and I don't really know much of where this is coming from, but well, I just put it as simply as I can. If your process is working, if it's successful, as each bit of that shadow work is successful, as each piece of the mind system that was operating in a distorted fashion due to that past trauma, as it succeeds in becoming integrated with the person that you are who is working through this trauma now in the present, it should produce its own positive affect. And if it's not, you need to examine more carefully what you're actually doing, making sure that you're not trying to box up and hide the results of these past traumas. And hopefully you're not. But that's the first thing that comes to my mind. It's the second thing that comes to my mind. The first thing that comes to my mind is if you feel, or anyone listening to this feels at all like you're having trouble, it doesn't matter whether it's due to depression or anxiety or problems in your life, or I don't care what it's due to. If you're having trouble with positivity, do meta. Wish that you had done a lot more meta in the past. The more meta, but the past doesn't matter. It's the future that counts. Start doing meta, do meta meditation, do a lot of meta meditation, reinforce the mind's ability, the mind system's ability to reinforce the power of the strange attractor that corresponds to the mental states, that the four mental states that you cultivate in that meta practice, and that eventually converge into a single mental state. Mental state. Make that more powerful. Make that deeper. Make that more accessible to the mind system through doing that kind of meditation. When you're doing this kind of shadow work, this psychological work, accompany it with meditation so that you don't lose, with meta meditation so that you don't lose that. Okay? And so that's the best I can do for you under the circumstances right now, Pablo. It's just, and for everybody listening. Anyone care to comment on that? Well, I'll just leave you with something that I would like everyone listening to this to remember, is that this is an incredibly powerful practice in terms of how it trains your mind system. As a complex, dynamic system, as a self-organizing system, the mind system can systematically train itself to enter into states, valuable states, like the state that corresponds to this meta practice, through repetition. Even though at first it may seem contrived, the more you do it, the more the mind will learn. And the easier, the more accessible it becomes, and the more stable and resilient it becomes. Metta practice is a very, very powerful way of developing a mental state corresponding to the Brahma Viharas as a whole. Metta is only the beginning of it. Okay, it makes use of a variety of different techniques. It makes use of intention, which we discussed in the context of prayer. It makes use of visualization. It makes use of giving as a gift. You're not only cultivating these mental states in your own mind to your own benefit, but you reinforce that cultivation enormously by giving it to others and by progressively working to be able to give it and share it even with those that have made your life more difficult, even with those for whom you might otherwise feel aversion or even hatred. So that's what I'd like to leave you with today. And thank you for...
Culadasa,
Yes.
there's one question in the chat.
Oh. Okay, Gunnar, please.
Hi, Culadasa. I have actually just written the question. If you want to refresh the screen, or I can voice it right now.
Oh, I didn't show up in my chat box. If that's where you wrote it, or did you?
Oh, I added it to Patreon.
Oh, you added to Patreon. Let me go back there and refresh that.
Okay,
And,
appreciate it.
And okay, what is the usefulness and effect of following your heart or following your inner voice in relationship to developing powerful mindfulness? Do you have knowledge or experience that the following of one's intuition leads to the unblocking or acceleration of the development of an enlightened mind? Is intuition naive or super rational? Okay, well, following your heart or following your inner voice, you need as much training as you can have in the first, the second, and the whatever the number is, seventh or eighth of the Eight Noble Truths, or of the Eightfold Path, I'm sorry. You need to have developed mindfulness. You need to have some degree of wisdom. You need to have carried that wisdom to the point of it affecting your thoughts and intention in order to be able to trust an idea like following your heart or following your inner voice. Intuition is a message coming into consciousness from your deep unconscious, the vast and deep unconscious mind. You need to be able to distinguish wise advice, a wise direction provided by your heart, a wise direction provided by your inner voice from those others. The first noble truth is cognitive. It's that understanding of interconnectedness and just all of the other truths that the Buddha taught, whether they're in that particular form or not. The second is conative. It is how that intellectual understanding becomes the basis for your thoughts and emotions and intentions. Because following your heart without some basis of intellectual understanding of wisdom that has been incorporated into your intentions, is going to, it can lead you into trouble. It can take you the wrong way. Your inner voice can be misleading. Your intuition can be based on false assumptions and things like that. On the other hand, how to frame this? Okay, I know how to frame this. As a teacher and as a mentor in giving advice, the progression is from me pointing out, answering the question that people comes to me, am I on the right track or not? Or this is what I'm doing, is it okay? I have a knowledge and experience that perhaps they don't have yet. And so that I can assure them that, yes, that is the right track, or no, that's not quite right. Let's look at that a little more closely and reframe that. But the progression is as I see their understanding develop and their ability to incorporate that understanding into the way they perceive things, and therefore the way they respond in thoughts and emotions and intentions, then the more I encourage them to trust their intuition, to trust their inner voice, the more I say, you don't need me to tell you, you're working at a level now where you know and understand your own mind better than I do. You need to decide that for yourself. My role is really to guide in the beginning where they're as yet inexperienced and somewhat undeveloped in their understanding and its application. But then to tell them that, yes, you are coming to a place where you can trust that. And if you have any doubts, what to refer to, refer yourself back to the Eightfold Path. Refer yourself back to the Dharma teachings, right? You have a resource, and your understanding has reached a point that you're progressively capable of more independent thought and a more valid intuition, a more reliable intuition to follow. Now, the analytical meditation is specifically designed to help develop that ability. It's all about learning to have a powerful and trustworthy intuition. Every time you practice analytical meditation, according to the instructions that I give you in that appendix of TMI, what you are doing is you're using your analytical mental faculties to evaluate the quality of your intuitive suggestions, okay? The value of your intuition. The result of that is a growth and depth of understanding at both the intellectual and the intuitive level, so that they can work together and complement each other. So I hope that is helpful, Gunnar. Yes, that's a wonderful question. Yes, and I like it very much.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. And if anyone would like to add anything to it, yeah, you probably want to get on with your day. All right, so do I. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much. And see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.